Sometimes I look out at the Bessos River here in Barcelona, watching the light shift over the water, and I think about how far I've come. How much lighter I feel. It's a quiet kind of victory, not something you'd celebrate with fireworks, but profound nonetheless. There was a time, not so long ago, when that quiet didn't exist. When my whole world felt like it was humming with a low-grade anxiety, a performance I was perpetually failing. I remember it vividly. I was sitting in a cafe, same kind of light, same quiet hum, but my phone buzzed with a message from Michael Harris, an old college friend back in Austin. It was short, just a few words, but it landed like a physical blow. Caroline's getting married in 3 weeks. Sonoma Valley, someplace called Golden Vineyards. I just stared at it, Because the timeline, it didn't quite make sense. Not at first. Then it did. And suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place, the sudden business trips, the late meetings she used to have, the way she'd started dressing differently, almost like she was auditioning for something, about 8 months before I finally filed for divorce. But the strange thing? I didn't feel anger. Not really. What I felt was curiosity. An intense, almost scientific curiosity about how this particular story was going to play out. See, none of this makes any real sense without understanding Caroline. We met in Boston 15 years ago, at one of those charity galas neither of us really wanted to be at. She was in luxury real estate, I was in private equity. On paper, we looked perfect. For the first 3 years, maybe we even were. Functional, at least. Then my job moved us to Austin. We bought a beautiful house in Tarrytown, and almost immediately, she started renovating it. And that's when I really started to notice the pattern. Nothing I did was ever quite right. The furniture I picked out was trying too hard. The restaurants I suggested were obvious. My ideas for spontaneous weekend getaways? Treated like I'd proposed setting money on fire. I'm not saying I was an innocent bystander. I worked long hours. I got distant. I stopped trying to win arguments I knew I'd lose, arguments that felt less about the actual topic and more about proving her absolute rightness. But somewhere around year 8, I realized I'd started sleeping in my office a couple of nights a week. Not because of work, but just to avoid the specific feeling of walking into my own home. We had 2 kids, Chloe and Leo. And they split right down the middle, in a way that just broke my heart. Chloe was 13 when I left, and she'd already figured out her mother's game. She'd watch Caroline critique everything, my shirt choices, how I loaded the dishwasher, and she'd roll her eyes. This tiny, almost imperceptible gesture of solidarity that made me want to shield her from the cynicism she was learning far too young. And then there was Leo, 11, completely Team Caroline. He parroted everything she said about how I was cold, how I didn't care enough, how I embarrassed her. I couldn't blame him, really. When you're 11, and your mom is this magnetic, utterly certain force, you believe her. Caroline had this way of rewriting history in real time. Telling people I'd forgotten our anniversary when I'd actually planned a dinner she'd then cancelled. Mentioning my anger issues at parties when I hadn't raised my voice once in our entire marriage. The actual truth didn't matter to her. The story, her story, that's what mattered. Have you ever lived with someone who controlled the narrative so completely that you started doubting your own memory? The napkin incident, the one that really sealed it, happened at a dinner party she'd insisted on hosting. I'd worked a 16-hour day and told her I just needed to sleep. But no. She'd hired a catering team, rented specific glassware, created a seating chart like it was a state dinner. I was exhausted, but I was trying to help. So I set out the napkins, those expensive linen ones she'd bought from some boutique in Aspen. And apparently, I folded them wrong. She walked into the dining room, saw them, and her face, it did this thing it always did right before she decided to make an example of me. Her voice just cut through every conversation in the room. 20 people stopped talking. She performed her exasperation and disbelief like she was on stage, turning to her friend Sarah with this look that just screamed, "Can you believe I have to deal with this?" I stood there, holding a napkin. And something in me just switched off. Not in an angry way. In a final way. I looked at her, and the thought that came into my head was, I don't love you anymore. Just like that. Clean. Permanent. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just walked upstairs, took off my jacket, and started planning my exit. It took 6 months of quiet, deliberate preparation. I worked with a lawyer Caroline didn't know, a guy named Arthur Jenkins who specialized in high-net-worth divorces and understood that revenge, if you wanted to call it that, is a dish best served cold and legal. We moved money carefully, restructured assets, created trusts for the kids that she couldn't touch. The house, the cars, the furniture. I let her keep all of it. Sounds generous, right? Except Arthur had refinanced everything into her name 6 weeks before I filed. Tied to loans with balloon payments she didn't understand, and credit lines she'd maxed out without realizing the implications. I wasn't trying to destroy her. I was trying to escape without her destroying me first. The day I told her I wanted a divorce, she laughed. Actually laughed. Told me I wouldn't survive without her, like it was a fact. Like I was some incomplete person who needed her to function. I didn't argue with that either. I just handed her the papers. The divorce was fast because I didn't fight her on anything visible. She got the house. I got my freedom. She told everyone I'd abandoned my family. I moved to Barcelona on a D7 visa, found an apartment in Barceloneta, and I didn't correct the narrative. Chloe texted me every day. Leo stopped speaking to me entirely. I saw a cardiologist in Barcelona who told me my blood pressure had dropped 30 points since leaving Austin. Said I'd probably added 10 years to my life just by walking away. Caroline moved on faster than I expected. Within 4 months of the divorce being finalized, she was posting photos with Robert Vance, some commercial developer who looked like he'd stepped out of a Brooks Brothers catalog. They were everywhere together, charity events, ski trips, restaurants with wine lists longer than most books. She looked happy in a way that felt aggressive, like she was proving something to an audience I was no longer part of. Looking back now, the red flags were everywhere. The speed, the performance of it all, the way Robert's smile never quite reached his eyes. But Caroline had always preferred a good story to an inconvenient truth. Then Michael's message landed in my phone, and I found myself thinking about Golden Vineyards. I'd been there once years ago for a corporate retreat. The venue was famous for its architecture, some acoustic design feature where sound carried in weird ways, where conversations on one side of the terrace could be heard perfectly on the other if you knew where to stand. I remembered the event coordinator mentioning it, half joking about how couples should be careful what they whispered during ceremonies. I sat in that Barcelona cafe, watching people live their small, real lives, and I thought about Caroline and Sonoma, performing happiness for 300 witnesses. I wasn't going to the wedding. That would have been pathetic. But I wanted it to be memorable. I wanted one person to stand up and say one true thing, just to see what would happen when the story she'd built met reality. So I made a phone call to James Stewart, an old client who owed me a favor and knew how to move through wealthy circles without raising suspicion. I asked him to get himself added to the guest list. Caroline's wedding planner was someone who valued connections over verification, so that part was easy. And I asked him to prepare a toast. Not cruel, not obvious, just honest enough to let the cracks show. Then, I sat back and waited. Because the thing about Caroline was that she'd built her whole life on a foundation that couldn't handle questions. And I was about to introduce questions she couldn't answer. James called me 3 days after I sent him the details. His voice had that careful tone people use when they're about to tell you something's harder than expected. He'd gotten himself on the guest list by mentioning the Copper Ridge development deal. Apparently, Robert had been name-dropping that project for months to anyone who'd listen. James figured he could position himself to give a toast by approaching the wedding coordinator during cocktail hour, offering to say a few words as a family friend from the Colorado development community. Weddings that size always had people volunteering speeches, and coordinators rarely said no to someone who sounded legitimate. He asked if I was sure about this. Told me that once he said what I wanted him to say, there'd be no walking it back. I told him I wasn't asking him to lie, just to ask questions. And he said that was exactly what made it dangerous. Chloe reached out 2 days later through Instagram, which was how we communicated now because Caroline monitored her regular messages. She sent me a photo from Caroline's feed. Robert and Caroline at some wine tasting in Soho, his hand on her waist, her smile so bright it looked like it hurt. Then Chloe sent 3 words that made my stomach drop. She told me she'd been doing research on Robert because something about him felt off. The way he talked about money, the way he never gave straight answers about his projects. She'd found legal forum posts from investors in Dallas asking about Robert's development company, mentions of delayed payments and permits that never came through, and a pattern that looked like a shell game. She said a lawsuit was coming, maybe more than one, that she thought he'd been moving money around to stay ahead of it. When I asked her how she knew all this, she told me she called one of the Dallas investors, pretending to be a journalism student doing a project on real estate development. 14 years old and already better at investigation than most adults. I felt proud and terrified at the same time. Then she told me the part that made everything worse. Leo had moved in with Caroline and Robert full-time, convinced that I'd abandoned the family and that Robert was a real father figure. She said Leo worshipped Robert. Talked about him like he was some kind of hero. But she'd been watching Robert at dinner, and he didn't even look at Leo when he talked. Just performed for Caroline while Leo sat there like a prop in someone else's show. She told me she was coming to the wedding not to celebrate, but to document. She booked a flight using money she'd saved. Told Caroline she was staying with a friend that weekend. Planned to record everything in case something happened. I told her to be careful, that I didn't want her in the middle of whatever was about to happen. And she said it was too late, that this was her family, too. Leo called me 4 days before the wedding, and I barely recognized his voice. 12 years old, but trying to sound grown, cold in a way that sounded exactly like Caroline. He said his mom told him to call and let me know he wasn't interested in a relationship anymore, that I'd left and chosen myself over family, that Robert said a man doesn't run from responsibility. I let him finish, didn't interrupt. And then I asked him one question about Robert's last business partner and what happened there. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then he asked what I was talking about, and I told him I wasn't going to poison his mind with accusations, but I wanted him to do something for me at the wedding. Watch what people don't say. Watch who asks Robert about his work and how he answers. Watch his mom's face when someone congratulates her on the timeline. He told me I was pathetic, trying to ruin their happiness because I couldn't handle my own failure. Then he hung up. I sat there in my apartment in Barcelona, looking at the river, thinking about all the ways you can lose a child without them dying. The rehearsal dinner happened on Friday night, and Chloe sent me updates like she was filing reports from a war zone. Caroline was shaking, trying to hide it, but her hands kept moving. Robert told a story about acquiring a property in Miami, and 3 people at the table pulled out their phones right there. Leo gave a toast about new beginnings and how Robert showed him what strength looks like. Didn't mention me once. James showed up and introduced himself as a family friend from the Colorado development scene, and everyone bought it, though Robert looked nervous for about 2 seconds before recovering. Chloe said the guy was good at performing. I told her to be careful, and she reminded me she was already in the middle of this, that it was her family, too. The night before the wedding, James sent me a voice memo. I listened to it on my terrace while the sun set over Barceloneta, his voice steady and certain. He drafted the toast to sound like advice from an old friend. Stuff about foundations and making sure the structure can hold the weight, transparency in partnerships. He'd mention me in passing, make it sound generous so no one would suspect, then pivot to questions. Not accusations, just questions. How did Robert close 3 dealerships in 18 months when the market was down? Why did his credit lines get restructured right before the engagement? What happened to the investors in Copper Ridge now that the permits were delayed? He told me the thing about questions was that innocent people answer them easily, while guilty people get defensive. And Caroline was going to hear those questions in front of everyone she was trying to impress and realize she didn't know the answers. I told him he could still back out, and he laughed. Said he'd sat through 100 weddings where everyone pretended everything was perfect while the foundation rotted underneath. Said someone should tell the truth for once. Then he asked what I thought would happen after, and I told him honestly. I didn't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe Caroline would laugh it off, and Robert would charm his way through, and life would go on. Or maybe the questions would sit there like termites, eating away at the fantasy until the whole thing collapsed. Either way, I told him I wasn't there, and I wasn't part of it. I was just the guy who gave reality a microphone. Chloe's last message came at 11 p.m. Sonoma time, 2 a.m. for me, asking if tomorrow was going to be chaos. I wrote back that tomorrow the truth gets to speak as loud as the performance, that after that people can decide what they want to believe. Then I added that she should stay safe, record everything, and remember she was the smartest person in that room. She sent back a heart emoji, and I sat there in the dark, wondering if I just protected my kids or put them in the blast radius. The thing about truth is that it doesn't care about your intentions. It just detonates, and everyone nearby feels the shrapnel. The wedding was exactly what I expected. Perfect in that aggressive way Caroline always demanded, where every detail screamed money and taste and, look at what I built. Chloe sent me photos throughout the morning, showing golden vineyards with rows of vines going golden in the September light. White chairs arranged in perfect curves, flower arrangements that probably cost more than most people's cars. Caroline in her dress, this fitted ivory thing that looked like it came from a Milan runway. Robert in a custom suit, his smile wide and confident, like a man who'd never been questioned about anything in his life. The guests arrived in their Range Rovers and Teslas, women in pastel dresses, and men in expensive casual wear that said, "I'm rich enough to underdress." Everyone performed their roles perfectly, the emotional hugs, the champagne toast during cocktail hour, the way people kept saying, "Finally," and "so happy for you." Like Caroline had been waiting her whole life for this, instead of being divorced 8 months ago. The ceremony was short and generic. Some officiant talking about partnership and trust and building a life together. Words that sounded meaningful until you remembered Robert was facing investor lawsuits, and Caroline had no idea. Leo stood next to Robert as a groomsman, chest out, trying to look like a man, and it broke something in me to see him there, believing in this. Chloe sat in the back row with her phone positioned carefully, recording everything like she promised. After the vows, everyone moved to the reception terrace. This massive stone patio that overlooked the valley. And that's when I remembered what the event coordinator had told me years ago about the acoustics. How sound traveled in strange patterns. How the architecture created these invisible channels where voices carried across distances they shouldn't. Caroline and Robert did their first dance to some Ed Sheeran song, and people watched like it meant something. Like love was a performance you could purchase with the right venue and the right lighting. Dinner was served, some 5-course situation with wine pairings, and then the toast started. Caroline's business partner went first, talking about her drive and her vision and her ability to create beauty, which was true if you ignored everything it cost. Robert's brother spoke next, some generic speech about family and loyalty that sounded like he'd copied it from a wedding website. Then Leo stood up, and Chloe's camera focused on him, his face serious and rehearsed. I listened through Chloe's live audio feed from 7,000 miles away. Heard my 12-year-old son describe Robert as someone who doesn't run when things get hard, who shows up, who builds instead of destroys. He never said my name, but everyone knew who he meant. Caroline cried these delicate tears that didn't mess up her makeup, and Robert put his hand over his heart like he was genuinely moved. The audience applauded, and I watched my son sit down, believing he just honored something real. Then James stood up, and the energy shifted in this subtle way that most people probably didn't notice. He introduced himself as an old friend from the Colorado development community, mentioned some projects that made him sound legitimate, and started his toast with all the right words about foundations and partnerships and building something that lasts. People nodded along, comfortable, expecting the usual wedding platitudes. He mentioned me in passing, said something about how I was probably somewhere thinking of my kids today and wishing them well, his voice warm and generous. And I heard Caroline's breath catch on the audio feed. This tiny intake that said she hadn't expected grace. He talked about Robert stepping into not just a marriage, but a family, a legacy, a structure that needs solid ground. Then he shifted. So smoothly it felt like the same speech. Started talking about foundations and what happens when you build on sand instead of stone. He asked Robert how he'd managed to close those 3 dealership acquisitions in Dallas during the downturn. Said it was impressive. VE timing. And the question hung there, friendly but pointed. Robert smiled and said something about market opportunity and strategic positioning. Words that didn't actually answer anything. James nodded like he was satisfied, then asked about the Copper Ridge project and how the investors were handling the permit delays. Robert's smile tightened just a fraction, and he said they were working through normal regulatory processes. Nothing to worry about. James kept going, each question wrapped in admiration, asking about credit restructuring and timeline coincidences, and why Robert's business partner from the Miami deal wasn't at the wedding. The audience started shifting, phones coming out, people looking at each other with this slowly dawning realization that something was wrong. Caroline's face went from confused to angry to panicked in about 30 seconds. And then she stood up, her chair scraping loud against the stone, her voice carrying across the terrace. The acoustics did their job, bouncing her words back from 3 different directions, so it sounded like she was yelling from everywhere at once. Demanding to know who James even was, saying this was inappropriate. This was her wedding. James stayed calm, glass raised, told her he was just someone asking questions that good partners should be able to answer. Then he sat down, and the silence was enormous. Caroline walked off the terrace, heels clicking, and Robert followed her, his face red, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, phones out and typing, searching Robert's name and finding exactly what Chloe had found. Lawsuit filings, investor complaints, a Reddit thread from angry creditors. The wedding imploded in real time. Not with an explosion, but with this slow collapse where the foundation just gave out. Chloe kept recording, caught Caroline in the hallway where she thought no one could hear, the acoustics delivering every word to the terrace. She was telling Robert he'd said this was handled, that the lawsuit was frivolous, and then she stopped mid-sentence, realized what was happening, pulled out her phone, and called me. I answered. Her voice was shaking, accusing me of sending James, of ruining this. I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't ruined anything. I'd just let reality into a room she'd been keeping it out of. I told her life fell apart because she'd built it on a lie. Not my lie, but hers. She hung up. Within 6 hours, the toast video was on TikTok, then Twitter, then everywhere. Caroline's face as James asked his questions, becoming a meme about denial and performance. Her real estate agency started getting calls, clients nervous about association, her reputation crumbling like Robert's business. The lawsuit against Robert went public 2 weeks later, fraud charges, asset seizure, bankruptcy. Caroline inherited his debts without meaning to, creditors coming after her because she'd co-signed loan documents before the wedding. Robert convincing her it was for their future together, and she trusted him the way she'd never trusted me. Leo called me 6 weeks after the wedding, and his voice was different. Smaller. Younger. Stripped of the performance. He apologized, said he didn't know, didn't want to know. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about therapy, about learning to set boundaries, about realizing his mother had taught him to value image over substance. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a beginning, and sometimes that's enough. Caroline lost the house, downsized to a condo in Round Rock. Her Instagram went quiet. I didn't celebrate any of it. I just kept living in Barcelona, walking to my favorite bookstore, having coffee at the same cafe every morning. That's where I met Elena. She owned the bookstore, loved poetry, laughed at things that were actually funny instead of socially strategic. We started talking, then having dinner. Then she met Chloe when she visited for Christmas, and they stayed up until 2 a.m. talking about books and photography and what it meant to build a real life. Leo got engaged last month to a woman named Grace who teaches elementary school and doesn't care about status or performance. He asked if they could have the wedding in Barcelona, something small and real, just family. I'm standing on my terrace right now, watching the light change over the water, and I'm not waiting for anything to collapse anymore. The ground under my feet is solid. I built it carefully, honestly, without shortcuts or lies. And for the first time in 15 years, I'm not performing for anyone. I'm just here. And that's enough. Sometimes the real victory isn't making someone else's life fall apart, it's simply refusing to participate in someone else's lie and building your own truth. What do you think about finding peace after so much turmoil?